Hey there, beautiful souls. Welcome to Beyond the Surface, where the saying to be seen is to be understood comes to life. I want to begin by first honouring the traditional custodians of the land we live and work on. I live and work on Gundungurra land and acknowledge the traditional landowners of my guests near and far. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions and cultures of our First Nations peoples. The land below my feet is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. I am no stranger to the profound journey of pain, grief, anger and heartbreak that often accompanies the loss of church, community, faith and the unwinding of our core beliefs. In the midst of this labyrinth, I found healing in the stories shared by others who have walked a similar path. Each tale, unique in its own right, weaves an invisible thread of connection, uniting us through the tapestry of religious trauma and healing. Here, in the warmth of these digital walls, I want you to feel at home. This is a haven where your memories are not just acknowledged, but deeply seen and believed. So kick back, relax, and let's embark on a journey where your story is not just heard, but embraced. Welcome to a community where storytelling is a powerful force. This is Beyond the Surface. Welcome, Will. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited. I've been loving having these chats with people about their story. I do it for a living. I get to hear people's stories, but it's a little bit nice to sort of kick back and not have too much pressure to have the therapist hat on all the time.
Oh.
So it's nice to sort of relax into it a little bit. Where does your story start? Where would you start your story at? Because everybody sort of starts it at a different point. It doesn't have to be chronologically.
It's an interesting question. I would normally say, I guess, that my story starts being born in Canberra.
Mm-hmm.
I was the fifth out of six kids. My parents, what were they thinking? But I've been thinking quite a bit about, and through some of the people I've interviewed on Spiritual Misfits, this idea that actually our story goes further back than that.
Yeah.
And that our birth, our entry into the world is actually just a continuation of a story. So I won't like full on bore you with the details of that, just to say that I'm aware that I start in Canberra, in 1990. In Canberra Hospital. My parents were both kind of born on farms and moved to Canberra for uni and met each other.
Yep.
But I guess the things that are important about the early years of my story are that very kind of evangelical Christian household.
Yep.
Both of my parents, when they met at uni, they were heavily involved with student life, if people know that kind of movement. But they actually, interestingly, both grew up with kind of very, I guess, just what would you call it? Kind of respectable country faith. The family went to church because that's what you did.
Mm-hmm.
When they were kind of in uni, they kind of had their like becoming kind of on fire for God in that sort of language.
Mm-hmm.
And then definitely that would have had a big impact on the trajectory of their parenting and, I guess part of that story as well, without sharing other people's stories that are theirs to share. But in my family, we would all have a very different, me and my five siblings would all have a very different way of interpreting our childhood and Christianity and the church and where we sit with that these days. We're kind of all over the map. So, yeah, I guess that's a starting point.
Differing perspectives. Same upbringing, differing perspectives. That's what I tend to say. You might have all lived in the same household, but you're all looking through different lenses.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
How did you see it in your family home? How did you see that Christian upbringing in your family home growing up?
I was right into it and
Mhm.
was right into it, I guess, for a long time.
Mm,
I think I was the kid in many ways who, like, all of the systems, um, just they suited me well. The education system, it doesn't suit everyone well. It suited me
mm,
very well.
okay.
I was kind of a straight A student, and I probably had that sort of attitude in terms of my straight A spirituality, my
Yep.
straight A Christianity. I remember even as like a kid in primary school, like taking some pleasure in like telling other kids that,
Mhm.
Santa's not real. So the Satan Santa, a mix up. But like, Christmas is about Jesus. It's not about Santa.
Right.
Like I was a Grinch, a little bit.
Mm,
I think obviously there were positive aspects. I mean, for me, church felt like a really safe place.
mm-hmm.
A little anecdote from my childhood is that, again, because of the vast number of children that my parents had, there was one morning where they drove home. They got in the station wagon, drove home, and realized that they'd left me at church. And I like look back at that and actually feel like, in my mind at the time, it was a bit of like Jesus being left at the temple and his parent. Like I was like, yeah, yeah, it's fine. Like it's all good. I feel
Oh,
safe here.
the cross. I mean, I just love the aspect of that story that they were in a station wagon. It just is like so typically Australian to have a station wagon.
Yeah.
Um, I love the comparison between that you drew, even as a young person, to sort of draw that direct
Yeah.
mirror comparison.
Yeah. And then when I entered high school, um, so I went to a public primary school
Mm-hmm.
and was actually very disappointed when I went to year seven that my parents, I basically switched into a private, small Christian school that, again, was quite evangelical in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, I was actually really disappointed about that because all of my friends were going to Canberra High School,
Oh,
and
yeah.
the small Christian school. I did actually feel a bit embarrassed about it because it was a
Mm.
tiny school. No one had heard of it. So there was a little bit of maybe hesitancy in me about that. But actually, what happened is that at that school, again, kind of poster child of the places where I was, I ended up just becoming very much a young MSN evangelist. When I was in year seven, that was the time when MSN was a big
Oh
deal.
my goodness.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I'd be doing the Lord's work,
Oh my
trying to
God.
convince people. And again, like most people were nominally Christian at the
Yeah.
school. Most people, their families went to church. Like
Mm,
it was actually, um, compared to some religious schools, it genuinely was quite I would say, because it was a small school,
mm,
started out of a community, started from a group of families that were all quite passionate about their faith. The
mhm.
school's culture was very Christian,
Yeah.
not just in a tokenistic way. And I still had the mindset that in my school, I'm here to kind of save the lost. Like I was
Wow.
quite intense, I guess,
Mm,
about it. And I've always been a uh, probably drawn to microphones,
mhm.
perhaps for some unhealthy ego or whatever. But from my earliest days, I was quite happy to jump up in front of any group of people and just tell them what I cared about. And that's changed over the years in different ways. But
Yeah.
even from those early years, a part of my story was whatever I saw as true and good and whatever I felt passionate about. I was
Mm,
very happy to be very public about it.
okay. That's I mean, it's I guess you don't get that very often from from a teenager. You sort of hear that intensity that you sort of described sometimes comes, I guess, once they leave that high school environment, because there's still all of those stereotypical things that you experience during high school around social pressures and peer pressure and things like that. To already have that sort of fierce evangelism sort of perspective, is interesting for a young person to have quite early on. Um, it's I love the MSN thing. I think, did you say you were born in 1990?
Yep.
Yeah, so I'm 91. So similar era. So I I remember when the days of social media were much simpler. And it
Yeah.
was and MSN was the height of that. So
My
um
first email address. This tells a little bit about like the portrait of me at the time. My first email address, which I had for many years, probably
mhm.
more than I in hindsight would have been wise, but was JesusFreakWill@hotmail.com.
Oh
So
wow.
that was, I was, and my MSN name was often, a lyric from a DC Talk song, or
Right.
was very into, and I suppose a part of um, my household and that kind of origin space as well is that my parents being, and like my parents are the best, and their faith is beautiful,
Mm,
and it has evolved over time and has given me, I've had secure attachment and the safety to be able to go on my own journey of
mm,
evolving and changing faith and doubt, and to be quite like my parents and me. There's healthy disagreement, all of that. So
yeah.
I honor them. But there was a strong influence from, if people are familiar, people like James Dobson, Focus on the Family, these kind of very evangelical US kind of media. And that was very much in the water of my household. And so the Christian music industry from the US as well, like
Mm,
I definitely there was a number of formational years early in my life where the media I was watching, the music I was listening to, the magazines I was reading were
mm,
all kind of coming downstream from that kind of US evangelicalism, which probably, and because I was a kid who loved to read and would read
mm.
books by, again, people may not know these names, but people like Frank Peretti and kind of a number of like influential Christian fiction
Yeah.
writers.
Yeah.
Um, I think I was in some ways bound to be
Mm.
kind of, you're a sponge when you're a young person, and so I was quite happy to just regurgitate a lot of what I was immersed in at the time.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people who don't necessarily come from a faith background or who have never sort of been in that world don't quite understand when we sort of talk about how different the US landscape is to Australia in terms of Christianity, and it is very different. And so it it is much more influential, I find, than anything that has come out of Australia, pretty much. And it does tend to be a lot more conservative. I found
Yeah,
it sort of tends to, people will talk about far right and things like that, lingo that we don't sort of use here in Australia. But um, it it trickled through. It
yeah,
trickled through, and it still
I-
is trickling through, really. Like
yeah,
it's not stopped. It just looks different. But there was an era where it was very big, and it was sort of at the height of when it was sort of coming into Australian culture. Um,
yeah,
and it was probably the era where Australia was only really just getting mega churches, I guess. So they were sort of just starting to become a thing. And so, whereas that was already long experienced in the US, it was
yeah.
trickling on through to us. How did your own sense of spirituality shift and change when you left school?
So, um, I went from my public school, from my private like high school Christian school,
Mm-hmm.
which was year 7 to year 10. I then went back to a public school for year 11 and year 12. And
Okay.
again, kind of went into that space with this mindset of, okay, now I'm going back into the world.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because in that time, I was, again, yeah, I started to get into hip hop music. And so I wanted to be like a Christian rapper, and my kind of lyrics were about how I was like going to parties and not
Yeah.
drinking, and everyone else was. And, but
Okay.
at the same time, I made such beautiful friendships, and I actually really loved that school. It's actually where I met my wife
Mm.
of 11 years next month. My
Nice.
high school sweethearts.
Oh.
Um, but then I sort of, I did humanities. I've always, loved I guess the humanities. So sort of studied English and drama and a bit of psychology. And then I decided to study philosophy and English literature at university. And
Mm.
a part of my motivation at the time with studying philosophy, I would have said that I was partly motivated to study philosophy because I wanted to be able to strengthen my
Mm.
beliefs and just kind of have that sense that, well, if I can have kind of the best philosophical reasoning to defend my faith or to test my faith, and if it emerges from that, then it will be stronger and truer. And in some ways, I think that is true. Uh,
Yeah.
while I was actually doing my undergraduate degree, I would say that I had more of a defensive posture
Mm.
around, being the kid in the tutorial who was trying to defend the existence of God when that kind of was
Right.
the discussion for
Yeah.
that week or whatever. But I think it did, it did the thing that people are afraid of, and it started to maybe make some of my certainty crumble a little bit
Mm.
as I was exposed to other ideas. And the other thing that happened at that time was, again, because I was sort of right into my Christian hip hop, someone invited me to start joining them going into the youth detention center every couple of weeks on a Sunday afternoon and doing a very alternative church service for young offenders.
Oh,
And
wow.
so I was keen to do that, actually going in there and sitting with a number of young people whose
Mm.
lives had started in completely different places to mine,
Yeah.
who had, um, I guess, internalized so much negativity
Mm.
about their possibilities in life. It really started to challenge me, particularly as I started to ask questions around if these young people actually they finish their little sentence in juvie essentially, and they come to our largely middle class kind of largely white church, how would that go? Um,
Yeah.
and really feeling like that would be um, there would largely probably be a sense of awkwardness, judgment. It would not necessarily be a positive experience.
Mm.
And so I think I started to, um, and like again, I've grown up on the stories of Jesus, but I start to really think, well, these do feel like the kind of people that Jesus would be very comfortable
Mm.
being with, but perhaps a lot of Christians would be quite awkward being
Yeah.
with, or even worse, might be quite judgmental, as
Mm.
most of society often are. So I think that started to like form some cracks
Mm.
in my faith. And again, like studying philosophy at uni, very privileged. Sitting with young guys in juvie shatters your privilege. So
Yeah.
essentially, both of those things were starting to change maybe my experience of spirituality as well as my kind of mental kind of beliefs and the cognitive process around that.
Mm.
And then when I finished uni, some of this coalesced around me becoming a youth worker and wanting to continue to do that kind of work, particularly with young people that were kind of on the fringes or were, marginalized in various ways. I
Mm.
moved to the Central Coast where I live now. And my first day on the Central Coast, literally, I drove up in a Sunday afternoon in a borrowed car, and we didn't like had to spend the next kind of few weeks organizing where we were going to live, like sort of staying in a spare room that someone had. And my first Monday morning after that Sunday afternoon driving up in a borrowed car, I started working in a youth center in an area that was quite confronting for me as someone who had grown up in Canberra. Again, just the kind of challenges in that
Mhm.
area around domestic violence and low school attendance and all kinds of kind of disadvantage that the young people and the broader community were facing. The youth center is right across the road from the police station, right across the road from the court. we would go across and kind of be there for children's court, go and
Yeah.
help out with yeah, young people while they're waiting in the station and all of that. And I think that continued to increase some of those cracks around just like, yeah, the faith of the privileged, or the faith
Mm.
of the comfortable
Yeah.
gets challenged in those spaces. And I was like, this job was with the Salvos, and the Salvos is like a great place for having some of those social um,
Mm.
kind of norms challenged. Salvos, for all their faults, like all kind of denominations have, in general, if you go to a Salvos service, chapel, whatever, you're probably going to be hanging out more with people who are aware that they
Mm.
are kind of on the fringes, or struggling, or working through addiction programs or whatever. Um, so there was that, and then I suppose a couple of years later, the other like big thing that probably accelerated my shifting spirituality is like two things at once. I started in a role as a young adults pastor at a church up here,
Yeah.
and I started that role 2 months after becoming a dad. So our first son was born, and then 2 months later, I start this role as a pastor, and I started to do Bible college at the same time. That was kind of, I got the job, and it was sort of like, I'll do my kind of post grad kind of
Yeah.
Bible college study now.
Lots of change.
Lots of change. And our introduction to parenting was quite difficult. We
Mm.
started with a week in the NICU, with our little bub really struggling, and question marks over whether or not he would survive. So there's kind of a lot of just kind of rocked me.
Mm.
Um, and then we kind of did come home with him, and he had very severe reflux. So our first year of parenting was pretty much just a screaming child all the time, and sleepless nights, and
Yeah.
it was really difficult. And I remember having nights where I would be kind of holding my screaming baby who we just could not get to sleep, and feeling really like blocked in terms of, I wanted to pray like, God, would you just like stop this fucking crying? Like, I don't know if
Yeah.
you're okay with swearing on
Yeah,
this.
no, go for it.
But I felt so distressed.
Yeah.
But I then at the same time I was like, but if you stop my baby from crying, and you don't do anything about this person in our community with cancer, or about hunger in the world, or about any number of other things,
Mm.
then I don't know what to do with that. So that's
Yeah.
kind of a real experiential sense of beginning to question, maybe some of those models of God's character,
Mm.
and yeah, the kind of existential questions around what prayer actually means, and what God
Yeah.
actually does in the world. And then so at the same time, so that's a significant change, and parenting brings up stuff from your childhood, and brings up questions around, yeah, all of those kind of household of origin things. I was also kind of seeing behind the curtain of church, and I don't say that in a negative way. Like, I actually still have a lot of gratitude and positivity towards that community. But there's just a reality you see, kind of like church as business, I guess, or church
Yeah,
as
the
an
business
organization,
side. Yeah.
um, and the politics in any
Mm.
community. When you
Yep.
see all of that stuff, and you're kind of part of like working out how to manage it, kind of as a, yeah, it's an organization like any other organization. It's easy to get caught up in just the kind of continued running of the show, etc. And again, I'm fine with kind of, the way that churches run themselves, but I started to just question some of that side of things as well, and felt that maybe it was didn't always feel like good alignment with yeah, my sort of sense of what a faith community ought to be characterized by. Again, trying to be careful, because I don't like, it's not like, that's not even referring to anything that's particularly
Yeah.
coercive or negative or anything in that sense. It's just kind of a demystifying of how things look from a different vantage point. And then sort of final thing, I guess, in this part of the story, because I realize I'm talking a lot.
No, go for it. I'm loving it.
Oh, cool. Well, while I was studying at Bible college, I kind of had this sense that I was beginning to be, like in philosophy, exposed to different perspectives. And I was reading, like, there are different atonement theories,
Yeah.
different ways that people, interpret like kind of difficult questions that arise out of the Christian scriptures. And I I felt like I realized that there was kind of, at the academic level, multiple interpretations, multiple ways of viewing things, a more nuanced conversation. But often that didn't translate to the local church level. And in most local churches, there is kind of like a bit of a dumbing down
Yeah.
of more sophisticated kind of theological ideas. So in some ways, the books I was reading, the study I was doing was actually helping me to create room for a more expansive understanding of Christian spirituality. But I was frustrated that most of my friends who were beginning to maybe question church or leave church, uh, it was sort of like, guys, there's actually other ways of thinking about this.
Yeah.
Um, it's just that, and I think that's partly um, to do with the internet and the spread of information. And I think, historically, a lot of local pastors, they just wouldn't have known that stuff,
Yeah.
and they're doing the best with what they have.
Mm.
But I think nowadays there's kind of uh, like there's just the cat's out of the bag. Like if people want to go and find better theology,
Yeah.
or a more robust belief system,
Mm.
um, there's a candy shop of good uh, insight out there, and there's plenty of stuff out there that's very average that you got to
Oh,
navigate.
yeah. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I was kind of cognitive dissonance of
Yeah.
the gap between spaces where it felt like there was more acknowledgement
Mm.
of diversity of opinion, and then kind of the often stereotype, I guess, that's got some truth in it, of the local church is just, here's what to believe it, and end a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there is now, I guess, largely a perspective of we have so much depth of knowledge now. We have and such ease of access to such depth of knowledge that I probably sort of sit in the camp of we're out of excuses to not do better. Like when you know better, you do better. And so I think it sort of gets to that point where you go, well, you know what? There
Yeah,
isn't a whole there's no more excuses now. There is so much knowledge. There is and the ease of access to gain that knowledge sort of puts us in the give me a reasonable excuse now that we are still at times perpetuating harm where there shouldn't be harm.
yeah,
And so I think one of the common threads that has come out of talking to people for this podcast, but also just in the stories of clients that I've worked with who have gone through various bouts of faith shifts and changes, is that it just comes out of human connection most of the time and human compassion to just see good in people
yes,
and to see good things happen to good people and for justice to reign and for oppression to be shafted and all of the like to support marginalized communities. And so I think that there is the invisible thread of traumatic instances and pain and grief and all of that detangling, but there's also that invisible thread that sort of connects everyone who has gone through this as just someone who has deep connection to people.
Mm.
And often I find the most, that situation where you got to go into the detention centers and things like that. What an incredible privilege for starters. That's incredible. But often I find that the most privileging situations, like you said, tend to highlight our own privilege, which is confronting. It's,
Yeah.
that's not an easy thing for people to tackle. And for some, it can feel too confronting, and it tends to just be easier to shove it down into, in a box and pack it away.
Yeah. I
And
think there's still a movement. I think this is like an ongoing challenge for all of us, but
yeah.
you begin to enter spaces maybe like that. And I know a lot of people with a lot of goodwill um,
Mm,
volunteer their time, whether it's, serving meals at a homeless shelter or engaging in kind of, you know, ministry in inverted
yeah.
commas or whatever. Like, um, but there comes a movement. Like first, it's like you go out. I'm gonna be someone who helps these young people in the
Yeah.
gym because I'm awesome and they're
Mm,
struggling. And then I think that like the beginning of that can actually help to shift some things. But the next like movement is just to really no longer see those people in any of those spaces as like fundamentally different to you or as in need of anything that you have to give.
yeah.
Um, and to actually just, you can still see, of course, like we need to advocate for, for justice, and we need to advocate to do away with every system that oppresses. But
Yeah.
until I see whoever it is, whether it's a homeless person or a young offender or a refugee or my next door neighbor or a white collar worker or like anybody as actually fundamentally made in the image of God, made in the image of the divine, and
Yeah.
just worthy of dignity, and in no way less than me. Like that's the kind of, I think that's the ultimate shift.
Mm,
I think we're all works in progress, but
yeah.
to see nobody else as less than or
Mm,
even as other, but to look in every face and see a mirror of what is in us.
mm,
Um, and yeah, I mean that to me is kind of what it means to see Christ in the world, or whatever language people want to use, but
yeah.
to kind of transcend, like again, to acknowledge the very real divisions and inequities within our society,
Mm,
but like simultaneously transcending so many of those boundaries,
mm,
and actually seeing each person. Which I mean, when Jesus talks about loving an enemy, like that
mm,
is what that means. I think
yeah.
to see humanity where we have dehumanized.
Mm, absolutely. It's that ability to see someone's innate sense of worth without knowing a single thing about them, regardless of, it's, um, yeah, it's not seeing, I guess, those things to sort of highlight the separateness,
Yeah.
and the differences. You talked a little bit about the fact that I like to use, I know the hot topic word is deconstruction. It's like hashtag deconstruction. I do it myself on my on my social media as well. But it's never really been a term that I've like connected with too much. I tend to like the word detangling a little bit more, because I just feel like it's just been a little bit more of, I tend to use the imagery of, like when you pull out Christmas lights and you're trying to work out what light's blown and how that's impacting all of the other lights. And once you detangle it, you've got a much fuller picture and things like that. But you sort of, alluded to it giving more of an expansive sense of faith and sense of spirituality. The reality, I guess, is that that's not everybody's experience.
Mm.
What was different for you that it created expansion, not narrowness?
It's a good question. I think the few things that like played a role in it. I mean, I think like fundamentally, I think like I said at the beginning, like my experience of church, and I recognize this as privilege and maybe luck to some extent, but my experience of church throughout my life has been of largely safe,
Mm.
loving community that cared for me. And
Yeah.
right through when I was a teenager, I always had people that were a bit older than me that were really encouraging, that that really did affirm who I was. And again, regardless of beliefs, like you look
Yeah.
back and you can say how a person made you feel.
Mm.
And I felt seen and heard and valued. And they gave me the microphone when I had really immature and dumb stuff to say, and they gave it to me again after I said that stuff. And so I think
Yeah.
that's a big part of it. And I know that that's not everyone's experience.
Mm.
And to anyone listening to this who has had an experience other than that, like I just, I honor that may not have been your experience.
Yeah.
I think another thing is that because I was, working in a church and I cared, like again with the kind of philosophical background, like I did have a deep commitment to finding beliefs that had a sense of integrity for
Yeah.
me. And so there was an aspect of that whole journey that was lonely and difficult because I knew that I was starting to see things in different ways that I knew I was in my mind. I was like, it is Christian to believe in the reconciliation and renewal of all things,
Yeah.
all people, the whole thing, the whole cosmos. That's
Mm.
Christian. But if I say that from the front in this role at this time, I will get in trouble.
Yeah.
So I guess a part of my process was learning how to kind of allude to those things in a way that people could see it if they had eyes and ears to see it
Mm.
in my sermons or my conversations. But I
Yeah.
also wasn't like shattering people's constructs,
Yeah.
weren't ready for it.
It was
So just sort of
gently,
like, yeah,
gently done.
gently invitational.
Yeah.
I just meant that I had to, yeah. And like, I want to emphasize, I definitely have had plenty of my own kind of dark nights of the
Mm.
soul, of those moments of like, I just don't know, like, again, like holding my screaming baby and just going like,
Yeah.
where is goodness right now?
Yeah.
Um, those kind of experiences definitely part of the journey, and feeling like the kind of the hesitancy around letting go of
Yeah.
help, because there is still that sense of like, what if I'm wrong? And
Mm-hmm.
Francis Chan says this and he seems very convinced, and
Oh my goodness, I've not heard that name for so long. Gosh, instant flashback. Anyway.
yeah. um
Oh,
hey, what if I'm wrong? Or what if I'm
yeah.
believing all the things you learn to say, like what if I'm just believing what I want to believe because
Yeah.
my heart's deceiving me? So I still had all of those.
Mm.
But at the same time, like I was just kind of opening my heart to a view of God that actually feels like it does make sense of my experiences of a
Mm.
lot of people in my life. The way my parents have loved and accepted me, I would never for a second feel like there's anything I could do that would get them to want to chuck me into some sort of forever suffering.
Yeah.
And if my parents love me like that, like surely if there's a creator who is good,
Mm.
that creator, and if that creator is love, then that love ought to be at least as welcoming and embracing as the love of my parents.
Yeah.
So I think it actually made sense of a lot of just what is intuitive, particularly again if you've had good, secure attachment and positive relationships. And again, acknowledge that's not everyone's experience. But for me, like I think I was primed to maintain belief in a good God because I've had good, secure, safe relationships in my
Mm.
life. I know that's huge.
Yeah.
Uh, and I suppose the other thing is just like, yeah, that access to information. I
Mm.
was able to read books by Pete Enns and Rachel Held Evans and Rob Bell. And,
Yeah.
I was listening to all the podcasts and like, yeah, so I felt guided into a wider belief by others who had walked the path beforehand, and realizing that actually a lot of that is like being part of the tradition for
Yeah.
thousands of years. In fact, the the faith of the kind of early church, before the church got entangled with empire,
Mm.
it would be almost unrecognizable compared to what a lot of modern evangelical Christianity is built on.
Yeah.
There was no emphasis on hell in that. There was no atonement theory in the early days that had anything to do with God, like somehow um, butchering his son because somebody had to bleed, and that kind of covers you. And like that just actually wasn't. That's not there in the early days of the tradition. That a lot of that got inserted
Mm.
later on. I mean, our images of hell come straight from like Dante's Inferno and kind of medieval,
Mm.
paintings on walls to keep the peasants in line. So yeah, um, there are some thoughts sparked by that question.
um, I'm wondering, I guess, how, because it is, I still have friends who are very deeply ingrained in, I guess, a traditional church system, a church environment, traditional faith of Christianity. And, you know, uh, you sort of hear things from them around, people who have progressive faith or progressive theology and that terminology. And so I guess I'm sort of going, how does your spirituality and sense of faith reckon with some of the things that are happening, particularly in Australia, around, how the church is using its privilege to discriminate and to cause harm? How do you reconcile those things?
Mm.
Big
Well,
question,
big
sorry.
question.
Big
No,
question for, 8:20 on a Thursday night.
yeah. So like a small part of the answer to that is that I reached a point within myself where I had a strong sense that um, the people that I wanted to be with,
Mm.
in terms of, not like, I know that all the language is loaded and difficult, but in any part of me that feels like a pastor,
Yeah.
like a shepherd or whatever, I really had this sense that there was a mismatch between the people I was with on a Sunday preaching a sermon to,
Mm.
and the people that my heart felt um, more like of a lean towards. And many of those people were my friends who had left church after the same-sex marriage plebiscite revealed such an ugly picture of Christianity.
Yeah.
Um, many of my friends leaving church because they felt that, yeah, an honest question about the goodness of God who would send people to hell is just not a question you can ask
Mm.
um, in a Sunday service environment. So I suppose part of the answer for me was the question, like, could we try to create an environment where those things would be okay,
Mm.
where all people would be welcomed, where those people that have been excluded would actually be actively told, we're not just going to tolerate you, like we
Yeah.
celebrate you. We are incomplete without you. We have been missing your voices and your perspectives. Yeah, and so we started a community out of that church, and again, like actually with good relationship with that church, and maybe like somewhat naively still maybe people would see it as this, but like my sense always was, and to some extent still is, that I could create like a kind of a two-way path where we could kind of extend out of that space into somewhere that's a bit more inclusive and just, etc. But that we could also maybe maintain that relationship, so that hopefully the where we're coming from would actually come to see, there's what they're doing is not actually that. It's not that. It's kind of just a basic decency.
Yeah.
Um, so there's always questions around how much you try and change something from within, or how much you try and just kind of completely leave and,
Yeah.
cut all those ties. And I've probably largely over time lent towards trying to stay, as someone who can see, the good in, like, across the aisle type thing. I've felt in the last couple of years probably more that there are spaces where it's important for me, to just like, yeah, move on from, because my energy there is no longer constructive,
Yeah.
and kind of just let them go down their own spiraling vortex into whatever is left. I think a lot of that stuff, I mean, it's tricky because I think a lot of those expressions, and as we talk about like the church in Australia right now, like I think a lot of expressions of Christianity are like writhing in the pains of death.
Mm.
And it'd be great to just allow them to die.
Yeah.
Same time, while that happens, there is like a strong resolve from some people to like do everything they can to, like, there's the doubling down
At
and
all
battening
costs.
down the hatches, and
Yeah.
so I like, I do think that there are forms of Christianity that will die, because
Mm.
historically it's, again, the faith that people have these days, like the toxic versions of faith people have these days, are different to the toxic versions of faith
Yeah.
people had a few hundred years ago. So these ones will die.
Mm.
Beautiful things will emerge. New toxicity will emerge. Um, but I suppose I find, and part of the podcast I create, it has reminded me, that, like, if you look for it, there are
Mm.
just so many examples of people, living out something very beautiful,
Yeah.
very good, and they're not necessarily making headlines, and they're not necessarily trying to grow their mega anything,
Yeah.
but they are just kind of the people I try to bring to mind as like my reference points. And I talk to some of my friends sometimes around, it's really important, like when you think about a group of people that you are inclined to feel, you want to other them,
Mm.
um, you probably bring to mind the most negative examples you can think of when it comes to that group. It's a natural thing that we do.
Mm.
It's like a defense mechanism.
Yeah.
But you have some say in who your reference points are
Mm.
if you're conscious about it. And so even take a group that you like, I struggle with conservative Christianity, but I try to make my reference point the people in that space who I do have admiration and
Yeah.
warm relationships with,
Yeah.
so that when I talk about that group, I'm trying to bring those people to mind as my
Mm.
reference point. There are absolute dickheads out there,
Yeah.
but I'm gonna, try,
Mm.
to think of the people that I know are good and well-meaning and people of integrity within the belief system that they are currently in and committed to, and that may
Yeah.
never change. And you can apply that again, like whatever your politics, whatever your kind of ideology, whatever group of people offends you,
Yeah.
choose better reference points than, the worst expressions of that.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that helps me to maintain some hope in,
Mm.
I see a lot of beauty, in terms of what Christian spirituality can look like, and kind of beautiful reclamations of kind of ancient and
Mm.
progressive. Like I think a lot of the people I look up to, their faith is both ancient and very forward leaning. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I suppose depend on what you look at. And there's lots of things that can get me very discouraged and make me feel like let's just move on from the whole thing. But then I
Yeah.
try to, put my eyes on some people that are, and often those are my LGBTQI plus Christian friends who, I kind of look at and think, you are a model. Like when people think about Christianity, why don't they think about you? You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Or other friends who, again, they're like the marginalized or like edge voices, but it's like, whoa, like if people are looking at this as the model,
Mm.
they would not have negative things to say because this person is gentle and kind and compassionate and fierce in all the right ways. So why don't those people get to be part of defining what it means?
Yeah. I I don't think I've ever heard it referred to as a reference point, but I love that. I often will tell my clients, let's shift the goalposts. And it's a similar sort of notion, but I love that. I also, I think, as most people who have sort of come out of any sort of faith shift, whether you have, left religion, Christianity, or somewhere in between, is conservative Christians do tend to grind your gears, and you do tend to think about, the people who make the headlines, or the people who you see coming up in your as you doom scrolling on social media and things like that. But there are some incredibly beautiful and kind conservative Christians who I used to go to church with, who would not hurt a fly if they, came across it. And so I love that notion, because it is really easy, when you have been hurt by the church and by people and by God, that to sit in the anger and to just stew in it. And, we know that anger is a very valid and a very real and present emotion. But the longer we sit in it, the more it tends to just seep out into other areas. And I think, reframing that, who is my reference point for these groups of people? And I think the closer to home those reference points are, the more compassion and empathy and gentleness we can have towards just people and just, the humanity.
You've got to separate, like, it is important to be angry and to critique
absolutely.
and to, like, at the systems level
Yeah.
and at the ideology level.
Yeah.
And, like, if an idea is harmful, go to town on it.
It's
Like, I'm not
harmful. Yeah.
saying think about a kind person so that you can let go of your critique of
Yeah.
what is harmful in that space. And like, I want to be able to be scrutinized in the same way. I want people to be able to say, well, Will's a lovely guy, but Will, like, you are still a participant in and a beneficiary of systems that harm. Like, no one gets out of
Yeah.
doing that work. But I guess it's just that, rehumanize people, but be ruthless in your kind of dismantling of your disentangling of systems. And often I think I'm realizing that, in our deconstructing or detangling of things like Christianity, we don't often go far enough to doing that with capitalism, or to doing that with neoliberalism, or to doing that with what it means to be Australian, or, there are so many other kind of cultural narratives that we need to deconstruct with the same level of ferocity that we've often done with our religious stories. And I think it's like religion and spirituality is so all encompassing that it's natural to look at that and blame it, or, kind of assign to it all of your ways of being and thinking. But if you actually zoom the lens out, you might go, oh, my church experience was actually largely characterized by being within a capitalist experience. Or, and maybe you're actually not zooming out far enough in your critique.
Yeah, absolutely. I am reading a incredible book that most people would probably know. It's called Women Don't Owe You Pretty by Florence Given. And she very much talks about that sort of dismantling of beliefs and systems in society, and, oppression and patriarchy, and what it means to be feminine and what it means to be masculine, and all of those big sort of overarching questions that tend to dictate pretty much everything in society and the way that it runs and it's structured. And exploring that is going to be uncomfortable. It requires, growth demands discomfort. And so I think, anger is very real and there have you have I call them rage days, where I just like feel angry at the systems in the world. And
Yep.
and those days are needed because it keeps it keeps me in a stance of questioning and curiosity, and never resting on my laurels the way life is. And so I think anger gives us motivation to see things differently, to question systems, and to not just take them for what they are. We don't, just because they're in place doesn't mean we have to accept them and just roll with the punches, which is a very Australian mentality, I think, anyway. um, I am ending all of these episodes by asking everybody, what would you say to somebody who is in the depths of that faith shift themselves, who is just experiencing all of the encompassing emotions that come along with that? What would you say to that person?
I think about this sort of thing quite a lot,
Mm.
and am trying to, I guess, create work that is, a variety of answers to that question.
Yeah.
And I'm actually working at the moment as part of our kind of spiritual misfits stuff, working on some like a kind of like survival guide for
Oh,
people who are in the
nice.
depth of it. So maybe I'll let you know when that's
Yeah.
kind of ready, and if there are people that are engaged with this that want to know about that, you can chuck out a link or something. But
Absolutely.
um, one of the things I think is really important is just to like adjust your expectations around the pace. And this is what I often need to hear in all aspects of life. But I think part of maybe our generation, maybe our moment in time as well, like we just want things quick.
Yeah. Quick and snappy.
And and I think part of the wisdom, like I
Mm.
like to think of Christianity as, at its best, it's a wisdom tradition.
Mm.
And the Hebrew scriptures are full of like these ancient writings in wisdom.
Mm.
And I think part of the wisdom tradition is just the understanding that like it takes time,
Mm.
and it's okay to take time. If something feels really pressing right now, if something feels really urgent, if something feels really like you need to make like if something feels like an ultimatum to you, which again is familiar in some of those spaces. We've been handed ultimatums,
Yeah.
decide, give your life right now, or you could be at risk of, eternal rah, rah, rah.
Yeah.
Actually, maybe there is no ultimatum.
Mm.
Maybe there's a continuum, and all you have to do is you can pause if you want. You can pause, you can take a breath, you can sit on the side of the road for a while.
Mm.
But when you're ready, you can just incrementally keep making your way forward, whatever that looks like for you. I'm not going to tell you what your destination is, only you can work that out.
Yeah.
But it's actually not a race or a rush. And it's okay to
Yeah.
just go gently and slowly.
Yeah.
Probably better. I mean, my counselor from many years, well, while I was doing all of this, I didn't mention it, but a big thing that did help me was that I was seeing a counselor regularly. And
Thanks for the nice little therapy plug.
yeah, 100%. I did very important work. But he said to me, slow is fast.
Yeah.
Go fast, you have to go back again.
Mm.
So go slow. And
Yeah.
that's actually the way to make progress.
Mm. It is a common statement that comes out of my mouth most sessions is it's not going to change overnight, and it shouldn't. It's not expected to change overnight, because anything that changes overnight doesn't have a whole lot of depth to it.
Yeah.
So, it's okay for things to take time. But I love that it's not an ultimatum, but a continuum. I love that. Anybody would think you're a poet, Will. Nice little plug.
Writing poetry helps too.
Will, yeah, Will's great with words. So, but yeah, I love that. I think it's, there's a lot of cliches that gets thrown around, I think, for people who are in the depths of it. But I think for me, what I needed was to hear things from real people who had experienced it and who had been through it, and who were not just telling me what it was going to be like based off a book or a textbook or something like that. So I think it just hits different for people when it's something that somebody has come to from their own experience of learning, as opposed to from their academic experience, so to speak. It's that differing perspective, differing lens. So thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.
I love chatting with people. I'm so glad I made a career out of it.
Okay.
And you mentioned a few times about Spiritual Misfits. Take a look, head to websites, social media, because I think the more inclusive communities for people who are wanting to explore what an authentic sense of spirituality and faith looks like, these are the spaces that are needed. So, yeah, I think it's wonderful work.
Thank you. And thank you for being another voice in this space and creating more room for people to know that they're okay and it's all okay.
Yeah, I think it's just, there isn't a lot of language around a lot of this for some people, particularly in Australia. And so I think the more language people have to express how they're feeling and what's going on for them internally, their internal landscape, the more depth of healing that comes. So I think, yeah, it's wonderful. Thanks, Will.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Surface. Until next time, take care, stay true to who you are, and remember, your voice and your story matters, always.